These people are very skillful, these Hollywood screenplay writers and so on. They're skillful at generating an emotional response in a consumer of the movie and generating an identification with the cause that they want to advance. They are active promoters of a worldview and very creative and very conscious about what they're trying to do. Beneath the title of this Hollywood creative worldview, you have the following suppositions. God probably doesn't exist, and there's no sure way of telling right from wrong. All values are relative. Human beings have rights as radical individuals to choose their own lifestyle without consideration of anyone else. Third, sexual relations are entirely, well, I guess this comes under the rubric of relativism, but relations in general are global in scale. And this goes to international relations. For example, America, they say, may be at fault for the values and ideas that she has demonstrated in recent times, and America is probably responsible for many of the things that have gone wrong. Many of the American implicit ideas, these people argue, are probably wrong, including the idea of freedom and the idea of democracy. It's very interesting. They had a fellow on TV, well, he wasn't a screenplay writer, at least I hope he wasn't, in coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And he was saying, I'm a communist, and I think we should get rid of America. I mean, it's a very extreme point of view, but it's propagated in parts of the Hollywood universe. This point of view has also created the climate of political correctness, which makes it risky for people to express convictions about their faith or their views of other faiths that contradict the sort of political correct standard. I'll give you an example which I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning, actually. It's a very interesting story. In Paris, there is a satirical magazine called Charlie. I'd never heard of this, but Charlie's editorial offices were firebombed last week, and guess what? A group of identifiable Muslim, Turkish, well, I shouldn't say Muslim, Turkish Islamist activists claimed credit for it. And the reason they were so angry was that Charlie was going to produce a satirical edition. It was going to be called Sharia Week, and they had all kinds of sort of satirical comments about how Muslims should react, or how people should react to this Sharia Week satirical edition. For example, they said, if you don't die of laughing, Muhammad is going to give you 100 lashes. That's a fairly provocative thing to say, but it's also quite funny if you accept the validity of satire. Now, very interesting thing happened. Okay, after it was known that this satirical edition of Charlie was going to come out, the place was firebombed. And then you began to get some very interesting reactions, not in the Islamic press, but in the American press. Let me give you one example. The Time magazine bureau chief of Time, the bureau chief of Time, criticized Charlie and criticized the proposal that they were going to write a satirical magazine about Sharia. And they said, I can get this quote right, they basically said, I'm going to paraphrase, that it was absolutely puerile and infantile, and it was a classic case of Islamophobia, and it sure begged these organizations to commit the very violence which they claimed to be against. In other words, listen to that. This guy from Time magazine, I've never met him, fortunately, he says there is a phenomenon called Islamophobia, which is one of the worst sins that any individual can commit. And Islamophobia provokes people to terrorism. So therefore, you shouldn't commit Islamophobia. Now, it's curious to me, in the last few years of the Cold War, when Ronald Reagan was president, there was quite a lot of very sharp criticism of the Soviet Union, including by President Reagan and many other American officials. And I recall vividly that one of the columns by the then bureau chief of Time in Washington, Strobe Talbot, said, and President Reagan is particularly guilty of anti-Sovietism. Anti-Sovietism, what's that? Well, it falls into the same category of Islamophobia. There is this thing called Sovietism. It's one glorious thing, whatever it means. And then there is anti-Sovietism, which is a vicious disease indulged in by reactionaries from Orange County or something like that. The same thing about Islam. Islam is this great, colossal, divine religion which is so perfect, nobody should ever criticize it. And if anybody ever does, he's guilty of Islamophobia. So there is this, one of the things that this media worldview creates is a real doubt about the values of our own society, the values of political democracy in the West, the values of freedom, certainly the values of the beneficial role of the Christian faith in the virtues that our society has fostered and demonstrated. There was another very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about two prominent writers who were good friends with each other, the American Dorothy Thompson and the British writer Rebecca West. They're both dead now. But in the 1930s, these writers were, well, Thompson particularly was the first American reporter to get an interview with Adolf Hitler in 1931, 2 years before he came to power. And she immediately said, this guy is evil and he's going to do terrible harm. Now, how did she know that? Well, partly it was discerning through Hitler's personality what he was really like, and partly it was going to see Hitler youth summer camps and hearing young German teenagers say, our duty is to die for Germany. That made her realize something was very serious in this phenomenon of the Nazis. Now, Rebecca West was a British novelist who wrote brilliantly about the British traitors who championed Nazi Germany during the war. One of them was the famous William Joyce, so-called Lord Haw-Haw, who used to broadcast from Berlin sort of propaganda diatribes to the British troops and so forth. Haw-Haw and another of the British traitors in the same category fortunately was captured at the end of the war and executed for treason. But Rebecca West wrote a very interesting explanation of why English society had become so vulnerable to the corrosion of the ideas of the Nazis. And basically she came to the conclusion that with the essential continuing disbelief in Christianity, people had become vulnerable to ideas of guilt with no redemption because Christianity had gone. And people therefore felt guilty that Britain and the Allies had been nasty to the Germans, and so perhaps the British should pay for that guilt by the success of totalitarian movements like the Nazis and later the communists that would provide solutions to these problems. So we've seen in this country how guilt has infected a great deal of the social movements, both of the 1960s era and of our own day. For example, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, you are seeing examples of the same thing, a feeling that because some people got rich off the housing bubble, and the housing bubble demonstrated a serious weakness in the whole process of mortgages and so forth, that capitalism itself must be completely wrong. In fact, if you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, although I'm certainly not categorizing everybody as a nut or a lefty or anything else, there's surely some very reasonable middle-class people who've lost jobs or homes who are protesting at the maybe criminality, we don't know, of what went on to cause the housing bubble and its collapse. There are people at the edge of the movement who are advocating violence to create a sort of utopian correction of everything in our society. And that's very dangerous. And not surprisingly, Americans who were initially in favor of the Occupy Wall Street movement seem to be turning against it. How are we going to respond to these worldviews? How are we going to train people to know how to articulate their own views and to demonstrate the conviction that their worldviews are much more realistic and much more socially beneficial than these other ones? The first thing I think we have to do is to go back in history and say, how was the worldview of the United States first expressed? I mean, talking about the worldview after English settlers started coming over. And if you look back at that, you find it was the worldview of Puritan Calvinism, which definitely believed in God's redemption. It believed in God's special plan for Americans. It believed in the fallenness of all human beings, the impossibility of living the perfect life or living even a good life without God's grace. And that view was really strongly held for about the first 200 years of American history since the beginning of the settlement in the 1620s and 30s. If you read de Tocqueville, who was writing in 1635, you find from his description of America that Americans still thought of themselves very much as a people with a special spiritual destiny, a special spiritual calling, and a special spiritual responsibility. That was certainly true for the first 200 years. And then what happens, you begin to see a breakdown. I'm not going to go into great detail because it would take too long, but you see the tendency of universities to cut themselves off from the churches with which they'd been previously linked, to open universities up to the doctrine that science alone was acceptable as a criterion for study, and then particular individual scientific theories that began to drive out of the university marketplace teachings like philosophy by Christian theologians and theology, and the basic presumption of naturalism as the way the world has come into being. That, of course, was articulated by Darwin, and Darwinism essentially conquered all of the universities in the United States and set in motion a whole series of views that shaped the worldview that has emerged among most Americans from this mishmash. Freudianism, Marxism, of course, Darwinism and the view of the worship of science. These things have all polluted the climate with which we look at the world and try to explain what is happening. So how do we counter this? Well, I agree very much with Andre that Christians have to be informed what they believe. It is quite ridiculous that up to 40% of Americans who call themselves Christians cannot name the first four Gospels. Well, there are only four, but cannot name the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They just don't know them. There are other polls that show the ignorance of the Bible, the ignorance of the basic positions of the Christian faith is hugely widespread. Now, why is that? Why have you got churches where pastors are allowing their congregations to slumber on in ignorance and are not pushing them to grasp the realities, the wonderful, life-changing realities of the Christian gospel? Second, I think we need, and you're part of this, intelligent lay people who understand that to combat the culture of this mishmash of worldviews, we need people with really solidly formed worldviews from a Christian perspective. You've got to know not only what you believe and why you believe it, but why that belief should change everything about your life and about the way life is explained. This is the real challenge. Transforming a sense that something is desperately missing in our culture into an urgent need, an urgent conviction that it's possible to change this. I think a lot of people here, as I have been praying for revival in this country, a turning back to God. And that's something we should certainly continue to pray for. But I think one of the parts of that revival, if and when it happens, I believe it will happen, is that the people who call themselves Christians will be able to make a very convincing case why other worldviews are just nonsense. They just don't explain successfully, effectively, why reality is the way it is. I spent most of my professional life as a journalist, and I was sometimes asked the reason for my hope. It's interesting that the Bible doesn't say the reason for my faith, it says the reason for my hope, the reason for the hope that I have in Christ. And I said, it's very simple. If you're a journalist, you get to see the moldy side of life. journalism or news reporting is man bites dog. It's not dog bites man, because dog bites man everywhere. But when man bites dog, that is news. You see great people who fall because of personal vices or follies that they have engaged in at some time or other. And people who thought were going to be heroes of the day, who were going to solve all kinds of problems, turn out to have feet of clay. Journalists who are not Christians have the greatest difficulty explaining why the people they idealized and perhaps even idolized have fallen so short. But Christians, I always used to say, they are the only people who have a common sense explanation. Man is made in the image of God, but he is fallen, and that every human being, bar none, is capable of great lapses of virtue and wisdom and decency. And there, but for the grace of God, go all of us. If you can find a better explanation of why bad people do well and why evil crops up in different places, please give it to me. But I don't think you'll find it. I think the Christian explanation remains the best of all. And that's why I think we have a real priority to acquire an understanding of the Christian worldview and to articulate it in how we view life. Thank you.